Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Robert Young, professor of saxophone at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. Thank you for being on the show, Dr. Young. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Owen. It's my pleasure to be a part of this, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'll go straight into the first question. The saxophone has a large dynamic range, but it takes a lot of attention to detail to make convincing changes in volume or texture. Are there any exercises in particular that you use to work on dynamic contrast?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess I'll start off by answering that question by telling about a experience that I had in my first year studying at the University of Michigan. I'm a former Donald Cinta student. So my first couple or few lessons I had with Cinta in my first year as a master's student, I remember asking him a question just about this. Like, I felt like I had a kind of like a governor on my sound that I couldn't push past a certain dynamic level on the upper end. And what he had me do was he pulled out his saxophone and he stood on one side of the room and I stood on the other, and he put a drone on, and we essentially played. He told me to play as loud as I possibly can. The only rule is try to play it in tune. Don't worry about the sound. And all we did was played a series of whole notes. We just played 5-1 in every key. So he would play, and then I would play, and he would play, then I would play. We would go up a half step and kind of just trade off like that. And the idea here was that I was testing my limits. I wasn't worried too much about my sound. I was just trying to keep the pitch relatively stable. But what I realized what he was doing is he was trying to teach me or show me where my red line was, where my limit was. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do as saxophonists in the practice room. I think a lot of students that I have come in my office, they tend to have a limit, and when you ask them to play louder or play with more intensity or just for an exercise sake, play as loud as you can, usually what they give you is a dynamic in which they probably have like 20% more of sound or volume to produce past that given point. And so what I encourage everybody to do, and what I do for myself, is I spend some time from time to time trying to find where my limit is, and even sometimes going past my limit, finding the place where my sound starts to break apart a little bit. And just towing that red line and trying to figure out where that is, and the more I do that, one, I feel like I can control the louder dynamics better, is because I spend more time playing, those louder dynamics. I think it's easy for us to get into a rut in the practice room of playing a good mezzo forte all the time, and not really getting into the habit of playing our wide dynamic range until we get into showtime situations, like with piano or for playing a concerto or something like that. Without mentioning any names, I had a friend when I believe I was studying in undergraduate, and this person auditioned for a school and they were playing the Doll Concerto. And after the audition, the teacher gave the student a lesson. And I remember the student told me they asked this professor, do you have any recommendations about this high E or high F, altissimo E and altissimo F, because I'm really struggling with it. And the teacher told the student, or asked the student, well, how long have you been playing altissimo E and altissimo F? And that was kind of like a natural question to ask, but for whatever reason, that question like really stuck to me, because really the issue there is, I can give you fingerings, I can give you exercises, but if you never spent a lot of time just playing up there, then, the fingerings aren't really going to matter. So kind of going back to dynamics, if we never spend that time playing big in the practice room or getting into a bigger space and playing big before the recital and before the rehearsal, then it's kind of not reasonable for us to think that we're going to be able to just turn that on a dime. So in terms of exercises, I don't necessarily have a specific exercise, but I just encourage myself and also my students to try to find where that line is. And also, I would say that the things that we do adjacently, like what we do in the warm-up sessions of the warm-up time in our practice session and our conditioning exercises, those things will help you to figure out how to control the saxophone when you're playing that volume, like how to keep the saxophone in pitch when you're playing that big, how to stay relaxed when you're playing that big. So I think is a good question, and it's very important for us to have a wide dynamic range and a huge color palette. But I think the biggest piece of advice I can give for volume is that you have to practice playing at different volumes. And I think that's something that we fail to do sometimes in the practice room.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you're right. It is easy to kind of get into playing a nice mezzo forte, like you said, because, I think that's something that the instrument just does easily, and it's comfortable for most players. I think the more extreme dynamic ranges aren't as comfortable playing very soft or very loud. And I think maybe we as players overestimate our ability to do so sometimes. Like you said, we'll almost try to save it for the performance. Like, oh, I can definitely play that louder once I get on stage. But, in reality, that's really leaving things to chance. And that's, we don't want to do that as performers, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you play loud, I mean, there's other things at play. I mean, if you just leave it to chance, you maybe can get the volume that you're desiring out of the horn, but maybe you're getting some edge in the sound that you don't want, or that the music doesn't necessarily call for. Or maybe the music does call for edge and you're getting this nice, fluffy, round, beautiful sound. And maybe the music calls for some edge. So like we have to be able to practice at those volumes so we know how to even manipulate the timbre of the sound too, and not just get whatever comes out of the horn.
Right. And I think that's another interesting topic that we could spend a lot of time on is, not only is there dynamic, but there's also color and texture that teachers always talk about, and kind of incorporating that into, dynamics as well.
Absolutely.
So another question I have is, for music students seeking a career in academia, are there any steps that you would suggest taking now to help realize their goals?
That's a big question. And it's a challenging question because it needs addressing, and maybe it needs an answer, but there's not necessarily a one size fits all roadmap that does this. So my introduction into academia actually came from, I didn't apply for the job. I didn't really interview for the job. My first job was at Wichita State University, and the teacher at University of Michigan that I was studying jazz saxophone with. So, a supplemental part of my education, like I was studying jazz saxophone with Andrew Bishop. He was an alum of Wichita State University, and they asked him if he was interested in the job. And he said, no, but I have somebody that you should talk to. And they just called me and they asked me one question and offered me the job on the phone. It was a 1-year position, but that next year I auditioned for the tenure track gig and went through the process and won the position. So the steps that I took is definitely not the steps that everybody else is going to take. Maybe there was some, I don't like using the word a lot, but maybe there was some luck involved in it. But I think there's some even in my experience, there's like some nuggets in there, like the idea that we have to make sure that we have to make sure that we understand that we don't know where the opportunity is going to come from. My opportunity came from the jazz saxophonist, and I'm primarily a classical saxophonist. My opportunity came from the jazz saxophonist pitching an opportunity to me. I know several people that they get a recommendation, a verbal recommendation from an oboist or a violinist, that they might have spent some time with, 5-10 years ago in undergraduate, and working in their bachelor's degree. So the idea that the music business, this is my motto, the music business is a people business. And the people that you're studying with now in your undergraduate career and your graduate careers and your post, graduate careers, those are the people that you're going to be working with, forever. And I can attest to that, now that I'm on the other side of the fence. So, not burning any bridges, treating everybody with a level of decency and respect, and making sure that you're always professional in rehearsals and things like that. So that's the baseline. But in terms of finding some way to realize the goals, I think one of the biggest things that we can do is try to accumulate some knowledge on what it may take to get there. So even at the undergraduate stage, I would recommend people to start reading job postings. You don't need to apply, but the more postings you read, the more understanding you get on what the landscape is requiring of us, then we can maybe draft some sort of a plan in terms of what we may need to sort of get there. Something else that I would recommend is, we know that, it's no secret that the path of being a saxophone professor is narrow in terms of the amount of people that are interested in it. And if you compare that to the amount of opportunities that are there, especially like the jobs that are advertised nationally, like those opportunities are sometimes few and far between, depending on the year. But always there are more people interested than the amount of jobs that are actually open. And I usually bring that up not as a discouragement, but more so just as, so we have the knowledge. And then from that, we have to try to figure out, okay, most of the people that apply for these jobs are going to be able to play the saxophone. We have to be able to play the saxophone well. And also, this is a teaching job, so we have to be able to teach well. So maybe I need to get some private students. Maybe I need to, so that I could try to navigate what it means to be an effective teacher. And the other thing is, outside of that, what are some things that can make me look more attractive on paper? And I think we naturally go to the idea of, maybe I should pick up some jazz. Maybe I should pick up some music theory or music history. Maybe all of us should do that. But even outside of that, there are things that could look attractive on your CV. Like, are you a photographer? Are you interested in graphic design? Do you have a YouTube channel, a saxophone related YouTube channel that has thousands of subscribers? Nowadays, that is extremely attractive to committees, because that could translate into more visibility for you, which means more visibility for the school, which means a bigger recruiting platform, or another recruiting platform that the school can use to attract students to the university. So I think just finding areas that you're interested in, not just doing it just to do it, but finding areas that you're interested in that you can really dive into outside of just being solely a classical saxophone player, which is fine. But if there are other interests that you have, figuring out what those are, diving into those things, advancing those to a level that you deem to be presentable to a committee, and then trying to find a way to document that on paper, because they're going to meet you on paper before they meet you in real life, right? Through your cover letter and CV, trying to figure out a way to document that on paper so they can see what you're bringing to the table. So it really is a big question, and there's no one path to get there. But I really do feel like we have to make sure that we understand that this is a people business and your recommendations are going to matter. The non-official recommendations are going to matter. And also like just trying to find some interests outside of classical saxophone that potentially can be used in the field, once you get that coveted position.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. And I didn't know that you studied jazz saxophone as well with Dr. Bishop. That's awesome. I visited Wichita State this past semester. I competed in the NAFTSCR Young Artist Competition. It's a great campus, great school. It was really nice to be there.
Yeah. Actually, my first job position was called Assistant Professor of Jazz and Saxophone. So it was almost like jazz was the bulk of my workload at Wichita State University, and I had some classical saxophonists. I did the jazz ensemble, jazz theory, jazz improv class, and I mean, all of that was really because like throughout college, I just had an open mind and really dove into, in my case, the side of jazz saxophone. That just happened to pay off to my advantage of getting my feet wet in the profession.
That's awesome. Yeah. So this next question, this is one that I ask everybody who I interview. From a teacher's perspective, how do you strike the balance between encouragement and criticism while helping students reach their full potential as an artist?
Yeah, that's another great question. And not to sound like a broken record, but, starting off, the answer to this question is also like everyone is different, just like the last question, everybody's path is different. Something I admire about seasoned teachers that's been teaching for decades, and something I aspire to, is these teachers have the ability to sense, like they've had so many students come into their office and leave their office that they're able to like sense, if I speak to this student this way, they'll respond this way without now going through a lot of time and a lot of trial and error trying to figure out who the student is. I think a lot of these seasoned teachers, they're able to really just sense what the student needs at the time. I've been teaching this is my, I think, 13th year in academia. And I'm still trying to get there, but I think the question you pose is like very important and something that I think about a lot, and it's extremely important to be an effective teacher. So with that said, I think that so my first few years of teaching in higher ed, I was a very blunt, aggressive, even though it's out of my character and just hard teacher. And I think what I realized in retrospect was that some of the students actually responded very well to that, and it was actually invigorating to them, and it was motivating to them. But there were students that I think part of that kind of shut them down. And the more and more I teach, I'm realizing that that there are those two sides and everything in between. So there are students that I teach where, in the hour lesson that we have, I can go straight to the problem and say, this is what, we need to fix, let's try this again. Let's try this. And I think I could be more direct with those students, and they want that. And I think that fuels them and it inspires them even. But there are some students that if I gave them that same lesson, after a while, it might be too much, so I would have to sort of couple that with letting them know that you're doing a great job. This is just what we're talking about in this moment, but it's not necessarily what this is not necessarily what I'm talking about in terms of you as a saxophonist. So this is not me saying that as a saxophonist, you're doing poorly. This is me just talking about this one specific topic. Let's try to focus on this. So in some ways I have to figure out how to make sure that everybody is able to digest the information in the same kind of way. And I only can do that if I kind of approach teaching with a level of empathy. Everybody has lives, of course, I have a life and students have a life too. I just happen to be able to do this full time and nothing else, like this. I don't have to work at Target. I don't have to work at Starbucks, but, my students are working as students full time, but some of them have two jobs, and like that comes with stress, and that comes with frustration, and that comes with sometimes a lack of sleep, and I have to be able to like understand that and not give the students a pass, but teach them in a way that they understand, that I understand. I don't know. I just have to talk to every student differently and with a foundation of empathy. And in terms of reaching their goals, I think part of my job as a teacher is not just to teach how to push buttons on the saxophone, but I'm a mentor. I like to think of myself as a mentor. And, we talk through different scenarios in terms of careers that they're interested in. And we kind of go back and forth and just talk about the what ifs and what would you do in this kind of situation and what would you do in that kind of situation. And in turn, I think that when they graduate, hopefully they would have thought through a lot of those things. So coupled with, what we talk about in the saxophone realm, they're also maybe a little bit more flat-footed in terms of what direction they would like to go after they graduate. So yeah, I think everybody is different, just to kind of bring it back home. And it's my job as a teacher try to figure out how to give the students the information in a way that they can digest it. And that might be different from student to student.
For sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. Even just being a student, it's, you notice very quickly that, your friends and fellow students, they all learn, I think, in different ways. They all interact with people in different ways, and they play differently than the other students, So it's like there is a lot of, I'm sure, nuance that goes into teaching each individual student, properly in a way that suits them.
Absolutely. And if I can just add, just cut me off if I'm going too long, but if I could just add one more thing, I mentioned that my first few years I was teaching one kind of way, maybe on the more aggressive side. And now, there's still some of that there, but it's a baseline of empathy. I think what really changed is what, we have to realize as teachers that this thing called music is something that we're all students. And, like, I just happen to have more years of experience. I've bumped my head more times. I've maybe accomplished, a couple more things, but I'm still a student. I'm still learning. So there's really no reason for me to kind of put myself on a pedestal and teach kind of down to a student. If that's the position I'm taking now, I'm still learning. I'm, especially like the better schools, the more schools I teach at, I'm realizing that I'm learning from my students sometimes. So yeah, I mean, I think we're all learning together, but I'm kind of in a position where I just happen to have a little bit more experience, a little bit more awareness sometimes of the landscape. So yeah, I just kind of treat my students with that kind of respect because they're just a little bit earlier in their journey than I happen to be in right now.
Yeah, that's a really insightful answer. Thank you. So this question, how do you prepare for a performance?
So how do I prepare for, like, it's the day of the performance? How do I, or from start of like me starting the piece to, practicing the piece to months and months, getting to the culmination of the performance, like what direction?
I suppose any and all of it, like the starting on the piece, the months, like you said, leading up to the performance, and or the week leading up to the performance, or the day of, like any all of the above.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of maybe starting a little bit more broad, kind of early on in working up a specific piece or pieces for a recital or a concert. I think I've learned throughout the years that I can, I mean, I can get the pieces there, but how efficiently can I get the pieces, the music there? So even from day one of picking up and opening up the music for the first time, I try to be as efficient as I possibly can. Almost like starting it with the end in mind. Not necessarily saying everything is up to tempo right away and everything is, perfect right away, but I try to figure out ways that I can be extremely efficient with my time. And I think what that affords me is that, a month or a month and a half or even like a few weeks before the recital or performance, I'm in a good place. Maybe if I would practice a little bit more haphazardly and I wasn't as efficient, maybe the performance will be more stressful because I'm kind of going down to the wire. And still, like, there's times when I have to do that. If I was given music at the last minute and I have a couple weeks to prepare it, I have to figure that out. But in an ideal situation, I try to give myself some time where I can have the piece and the music in a good place with a good amount of time to spare before the day of the actual concert. And with that said, like on the day of the concert, I think something that I need, and this kind of is counter to me as a person, I like to be alone. When I get backstage, I don't like to be talking to a lot of people. Not in a rude or mean way. I just like to get my head in the zone. And I also like to visualize things. Even leading up to the day of the performance, I like to visualize. I find myself visualizing what it's going to feel like being on stage. I visualize myself going through the whole recital. And if I don't have time to do that, definitely the more challenging points of the specific pieces or whatever that I'm working on. And in order to do that, I have to have, some time to myself where I'm not really chit-chatting with a lot of people. And backstage for me is my sanctuary for doing that. So after I do my, conditioning exercise, my warm up, backstage and on stage, I really just kind of sometimes sit there and just kind of get my head in the game. And, I'll go on record and say that there are times going on stage that I get very nervous, even to this day. Like, I get nervous as I'm walking out on stage, but when I start playing, sometimes it goes away. But what I've learned to sort of mitigate that is, if I take this time to myself, really visualize myself going through the process and doing a good job with the process, usually those are the more successful recitals and performances that I give. So because this is not part of, I'm a people person. I don't like turning people away when people, stop to talk to me, but I had to sort of like learn to be okay with, taking care of myself too, and part of taking care of myself as a performer is I need that space to get my head right, right before a performance. And especially being a teacher, Owen, like I remember my first recital as a college professor. That was the most stressful I didn't expect to have that much stress before the performance, because now, of course, I have to play the saxophone well, but now, like, there are students that I teach every day that are wanting to hear me play at a certain level, and that are wanting to, that I also have to demonstrate the things that I'm teaching to them, playing in tune. I have to play in tune, so there's a lot more, in a good way, pressure that's on, us now as teachers, when we get to the stage. So I really need that time to really just settle my head and just be to myself and visualize myself accomplishing what I would like to accomplish on stage that day.
Yeah, for sure. That's great advice. And I think that's not always something I've thought about, but, you know, performing for your students has to be a different experience for sure. Like it has to be, you know, that it feels like there's kind of almost, I'm sure, more riding on that performance. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my next question is, what do you like to do outside of music?
That might be the most important question of all. I think I say that because, I mean, you've probably spoke with a lot of people in my shoes that probably talk about this idea of burnout maybe, or, you know, as a student and even the earlier part of my career, like if you asked me to talk about myself or who I would, I mean, saxophonist, that was what my identity was wrapped around. And what that can do is it can kind of lead to or approach burnout. And that's a whole nother topic right there. So I had to try to find ways to, again, like I mentioned before, take care of myself. And part of that is, you know, I have to exist outside of the saxophone. So I try to work out quite a bit. I've started running a little bit. I started cycling a little bit. So really most of my ideas of interest outside of the saxophone deal with physical activity. So I like to run, I like to work out, play sports, mainly basketball. And of course, now I have a family, you know, I have a wife and two kids, 1-year-old and 2-year-old at the time of this recording. So of course I enjoy spending time with them as well. And that's really what my identity is wrapped around now. And, you know, I'm still a saxophonist. That's still a very important part of my life, but really those things outside of the saxophone actually help me to come back to the saxophone with a new sense of vigor, you know, maybe more inspired as an artist, as a teacher, as a player. So yeah, I mean, I can't stress enough how important it is to have interests outside of the saxophone. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also plays into my next question, which is, how do you stay healthy while leading the busy lifestyle of a musician?
So that's assuming that I am healthy. No, yeah, that's an important question too. I mean, I try with, you know, underline, bold, italicized on try. I try to, you know, eat well, to fuel my body well. I don't always do a good job with that. You know, sometimes I eat the snacks that my kids are eating. But I think really the crux of my answer to your question is I stay healthy physically by carving some time out where I can just go and work out, whatever that looks like, whether it's getting on my bike, whether it's going for a run, and having goals on that side too. Like I kind of got sidelined about a month and a half ago with plantar fasciitis, but I was training for a half marathon. So like just having goals that kind of push my interest outside of the saxophone too. I mean, we always have goals with the saxophone, but some of those things outside of the saxophone, I try to have goals for as well, to try to, you know, push myself on that front too. And that, as a result, you know, of course, plays into my physical health and also my mental health, I'll say as well. So like, you know, so that's physically, but mentally, you know, I think part of my mental health really 100% is tied around being grounded with my family. And also, I would say, you know, your previous question, like whatever my interests are outside of the saxophone, just being able to feel like I can carve out some time to do that. Even if it's just like being by myself and just like thinking, I think those things are important. So when I hear the question about health, of course, my mind goes to physical health, but also like, mental health is very important as well. And again, all of these things tie right into being able to come back to music with your full self.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. These are the reasons that I like to ask everyone about these questions, because I think, the longer that people do this, the longer that people play music at a high level, they need something else. If they haven't had something already, people will pick up, running, weightlifting, or cooking, or, decide to, they need something else that diverts their attention or provides some sense of fulfillment outside of music, so that they can come back to music with the energy level and level of focus that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was talking to a saxophonist, Nate Bogert, and, he's has worked as a chef. So, and that's my sense is that that's something that, he's very passionate about. And I remember him saying in so many words that, like, even when he's teaching, there are some like correlations that he can draw from the cooking side to the saxophone. Those things don't necessarily, to the layperson, don't necessarily seem like they have anything in common. But I think that something beautiful happens when we do have interests outside of the saxophone, is that we can draw those parallels and we can talk about things in a way that might make things a little bit more tangible to the people we're talking to. Because music is, you can't feel it, you can't touch it, you can feel it, but you can't touch it, you can't smell it, taste it, so you can't see it per se. So it becomes very challenging to talk about. But I feel like I find that the more life experiences I have and the more interests I have, actually makes grasping and articulating this thing that we do more manageable.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. Thank you. Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 4 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Dr. Robert Young, professor of saxophone at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. I'm Owen Robinson, and this has been The Well-Rounded Saxophonist. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to practice smart and stay healthy.